Chapter 3. Dusk was casting its velvet spell by the time Gilda and Arabella turned the corner of Queen Street. They had arrived late in the day, and most vendors who frequented the market square had already gone home. They did, however, purchase goods from the few merchants left standing. After 75 days of nothing but fish, salted beef, and sea biscuits, it had proven impossible to resist buying a handful of fresh strawberries, which were, to Gilda's recollection, the best thing she had ever tasted. Arabella made short work of hers, too. Gilda had been doubly pleased to purchase some flour, eggs, butter, and a few other items. The modest selection of goods would save her from arriving empty-handed to Widow Westerby, an old patient of her father's who had agreed to provide shelter and a welcome respite between an almost 3-month voyage and their 1,000-mile expedition to New Orleans. Another 1,000 miles on top of the 4,000 they had already traveled would surely be sufficient distance to keep Gilda safe from him. The merchants in the square had been positively fervent to swap their goods for Gilda's British pounds. Unfortunately, for change, they had bestowed an assortment of poor-quality coinage she hadn't even recognized. She was taking it on trust that they hadn't relieved her of more money than they should. She would show the coins to Widow Westerby. Hopefully she would be able to shed light on this unexpected aspect of life in the colony. "Thought it must be you when I saw you turning the corner," the woman she presumed to be Widow Westerby said as Gilda approached the threshold of the only yellow house on Queen Street. The white-haired lady sat on an upturned metal canister knitting a pair of stockings. Gilda smiled. "Is it so very obvious that we're new here?" "No, but you've got your father's nose," Widow Westerby said, setting her knitting aside. "Why, Goody Westerby, are you implying my nose is so big it's visible from the end of the street?" "No, child, no," the old woman said before letting out a breathy cackle that took such hold of her she almost fell off her makeshift seat. After a moment she righted herself and stood to greet her guests. "How d'ye do, ma'am?" said Arabella, bowing her head of loose chestnut curls while holding up a basket of goods. "Mistress bought you some food on the way here. It's just as well. She likes her food, she does." Widow Westerby cleared her throat, clearly unsure about how to respond to Arabella's somewhat insolent comment. For the first 7 days of their Atlantic voyage, Gilda had reproached Arabella for such remarks. After that, however, she realized Arabella wasn't insolent at all. She just hadn't been in line when tact was portioned out. Consequently, she had taken to ignoring her maid's occasional boldness and focused instead on her good qualities. "This is Bella," said Gilda. "Give her half a chance and I promise she'll be more help than hindrance to you while we're here." "I thank you for the food," Widow Westerby said at last. "From what I hear, you've picked up a reputation as well as some eggs on your short walk from town. Made quite the impression on Mr. Clark, I believe." Gilda's mouth dropped open. "How did news of that reach you before we did?" Widow Westerby put her hands on Gilda's shoulders and then cupped her cheeks in her hands. "You'll find there are no secrets here, child. Everybody knows everybody, and everybody's business." Gilda was pretty sure from the tone that Widow Westerby meant to frame this as a comforting fact of life in Williamsburg. Instead, Gilda's shoulders clenched. How long would it be, she wondered, before the good folk of Virginia started to ask questions about why she left England? Why, at the ripe age of 27, she was without husband or family? Her father had told Widow Westerby enough for her to understand Gilda's need to leave England urgently and adopt a new name. The old lady had been sworn to secrecy about the little he had told her, but there was still so much she didn't know, and Gilda would prefer it to stay that way. She had a story prepared before she even bought her ticket to America, and tried it out when she had hired Arabella. Her maid had seemed satisfied enough with what Gilda had told her, that she did not wish to stay in England and marry an old man who smelled of brandy and snuff. Instead, she explained, she intended to cross the Atlantic in search of some greater fortune in the New World. But Arabella, orphaned and working for some powdered old woman on the outskirts of London, was more interested in asking about what life would be like in America than interrogating Gilda's reasons for leaving merry old England. From what Widow Westerby said, the locals here would be much more probing. Still, she only had to hold off their curiosity for a fortnight. If the questions became too personal, they could simply leave sooner. "I had hoped to see you a little more than a week ago," Widow Westerby said, breaking into Gilda's thoughts. Our ship was thrown off course by an unexpected current, Gilda explained. We were aboard the Royal Charles a good 10 days longer than expected. Thought it must have been something like that, Widow Westerby said with a nod. I remember from my crossing some 15 years ago now that seafaring is an uncertain business. But I must admit, when this letter arrived before you turned up, I couldn't help but worry some. Widow Westerby reached into her skirt pocket and pulled out a letter. It was addressed to Gilda, and she at once recognized the handwriting as that belonging to her brother, Andrew. He must have sent it on a faster ship than the one I boarded, Gilda said, a pang of homesickness pulsing through her at the sight of his familiar hand. She raised her eyebrow at the envelope, which had the word ship marked across the back in large letters, before pocketing it. Aren't you going to read it, mistress? Said Arabella, the note of curiosity in her voice utterly giving her away. Later, Gilda replied. Today has been the longest day of my life so far, I think, and I am in need of rest. Come on inside, said Widow Westerby, turning to pick up her knitting. The beds I've made for you are comfortable enough. We've a healthy larder, and if you need transport to any place local, Mr. Brownlow, who has the good fortune of being my neighbor, has a stable out back with a couple of horses. He'll be able to arrange a carriage for you with a day's notice. Luckily for you, he's happy to be paid in cider and cornbread. Gilda was doing her utmost to listen to what Widow Westerby was saying, but an uneasy feeling came over her. A sense of being watched. Was that whiskey she could smell? Evening, ladies, said a slimy but familiar voice. Mr. Lawson? Widow Westerby said, turning to greet him. Gilda's stomach tightened. Wasn't he supposed to be in jail sobering up? Perhaps Mr. Clark had had enough of the ape and turned him out. Are you well? I hear you had an awful skirmish with the natives, said Widow Westerby. That's one way of describing what happened, Gilda thought. And then, not for the first time that afternoon, she found herself again remembering the depths of Blue Sky's ocean eyes. She had such an odd feeling when he stared at her, as though he'd known how she'd looked with neither petticoat nor shift. It wasn't just his eyes that stuck in her memory, though. She remembered again the dark silk of his hair, so much more appealing than the powdered wigs favored by most of the men back in England. The soft bronze of his chest hadn't escaped her notice either, nor the way his muscles formed in chevrons that pointed down to all that lay hidden behind his breechcloth. How old must he be? 24, perhaps 25? Was that old enough to develop the kind of stamina she had imagined him capable of? I have a few complaints, Lawson said, cutting through a fancy Gilda would rather have held on to. Instead, it seemed she had no choice but to converse with a man whose behavior had been nothing short of vile since the moment they met. Those savages sure know how to fight, I'll give 'em that. Truth of the matter is, I came to apologize to Miss Griffiths. I don't recall the details, but Mr. Clark said I was unseemly to the lady, and I've come to ask for your forgiveness on the matter. I've been told I can get pretty mean when I've had too much whiskey. Gilda nodded, but did not offer Lawson a smile. She didn't believe for a second he'd forgotten what he'd done just a few hours prior, no matter how much whiskey he'd had. After that trick with the knife in her apron, Mr. Clark had probably threatened him with some kind of penalty if he didn't settle the matter. She wouldn't so easily forgive what he had done to Greathawk, who seemed such a gentle man, but she wasn't going to make an outright enemy of a violent drunk either. It wasn't worth it when she and Arabella would be gone in 2 weeks. I thank you for taking the time to apologize for your actions, Gilda said. It takes a courageous man to admit when his behavior has been out of line. We all make mistakes, Mr. Lawson. Lawson removed his hat and held it humbly in his hands, revealing a head of greasy blonde hair that Gilda was pretty sure hadn't been washed since the turn of the century. I was wondering if you'd be so kind as to tend my wounds, Miss Griffiths. I'm sure with you fine-looking ladies to nurse me, I'll heal all the quicker after what that dirty savage did to me. Gilda found herself wishing Blue Sky and Greathawk had done a little more damage to Lawson before he pulled a knife on them. It was a thought that startled her. As a doctor's daughter, she had always been taught it was not her place to decide who deserved to be healed, who lived or died. Only God could decide that. Won't you sit down, Mr. Lawson? Gilda said, deciding the least she could do to make up for the sheer number of wayward thoughts she had indulged in that day was to treat someone she would rather not. I'll go and fix you all some cider while you tend to Mr. Lawson, said Widow Westerby before disappearing inside. Lawson sat on the upturned canister and Arabella opened Gilda's medical bag. Without any of the tenderness or warning she'd offered Greathawk, Gilda soaked a fresh rag and pressed alcohol into Lawson's wounds. "Yow!" Lawson said, jumping a few inches out of his seat. "Why, Mr. Lawson," said Gilda, pressing a hand against her chest in feigned dismay. "Forgive me. I've never had a patient who found the alcohol so painful." "No, I was just kidding. I was just kidding now," Lawson said. "It was a surprise is all." Arabella covered her mouth in an attempt not to laugh. When Lawson wasn't looking, Gilda shot her a wicked smile as she continued to dab various cuts while Lawson sucked through his teeth. She knew these weren't the actions of a righteous woman, but perhaps after all she had suffered back in England, God would be gracious enough to permit her a little fun out here in America. She had, after all, vowed to make the most out of every day here. Contemplating that thought further, she couldn't help but wonder if her blue-eyed native might play some part in those hedonistic adventures, even if only for a little while.